Welcome to EPG Pathshala. We are going to discuss The Fall of the House of Usher by Edgar Allan Poe, Module 6, which is a part of the American Literature course. I am Niladri Chatterjee, Professor, Department of English, University of Kalyani. Before I go into the text as such, there is perhaps quite a bit that needs to be understood about a certain genre that we normally know as Gothic. Gothic as a genre is something that can be traced back at least to the Romantic period, which means that we can go back to late 18th century. And in the Gothic, we find various elements that were then later on transported to the US, and we find a full flowering of that in various pieces of literature, The Fall of the House of Usher being one of them. So what is the Gothic? One way of looking at it would be to relate it to the word Goth. When we think of Goth, we are basically thinking of people who are regarded as being anti-Christian. So we are looking at violent people, we are looking at terrifying people. Goth was very much a mental construction that was done by the so-called sophisticated, civilized Christian Europe. And Goths were therefore created as the cultural other. They were violent, they were terrifying. So when you talk about what is Gothic, you are basically talking about the culture that is violent, that is terrifying, and therefore that is perhaps also anti-Christian, or at least non-Christian. So if you look at it in this way, then I think it becomes very easy for us to understand exactly where does Gothic situate itself in the context primarily, say for example, of the Enlightenment, which is happening in the 18th century. Now, if you look at the Enlightenment as all about reason, all about logic, all about intellect, all about order, all about discipline, basically something that one can describe as the Apollonian, so this is all about discipline, order, then one could very well think about the Gothic as its exact opposite. Gothic is about the irrational, Gothic is about disorder, Gothic is about misrule, Gothic is about fear, it is about terror. It is about fearing things that we know nothing about. Gothic is therefore also about a certain demonization of something that we don't know. So it is the demonization of anything that we are not aware of. So if you look at the way in which people were thinking about Gothic, it becomes very clear for us to understand that Gothic therefore exerts a peculiar fascination for Europe across this particular century, because Gothic is that very strange thing. It repels and attracts in equal measure. People who are producing Gothic art, Gothic literature, there are two almost contradictory, opposite forces that are working to create it. So on the one hand, there is a tremendous fascination with the Gothic, with the terrifying, but there is equally a tremendous amount of interest in exploring the irrational, in exploring the terrible, in exploring the horrendous, the horrific. So there are these tensions that are always there in the Gothic. From your understanding of Romantic poetry, for example, you will know that there are very clear examples of Gothic poetry. One of the most famous examples would be Samuel Taylor Coleridge's poem Christabel, in which you have a young woman who is brought under the spell of this very mysterious woman that she encounters in the forest, and how this young woman comes under the spell and is basically taken control of by this mysterious woman called Geraldine. There are so many other such poems, many of them written by Coleridge himself, who himself was very, very interested in the Gothic. And remember, Coleridge himself was a God-fearing man. So here was a Christian who was absolutely fascinated by the concept of the devil, by the concept of evil, by the concept of sin. And these concepts of sin, evil, sickness, misery, death, they all come into the formulation of what we normally call the Gothic. Of course, by the time we come to the Jane Austen sort of group of novels, Jane Austen herself, of course, although she chronologically belongs to the Romantic period, she is already taking a certain distance, a certain comic distance from the Gothic novel, in which she produces this sort of comic take on the Gothic in Northanger Abbey. So when we look at the imaginary of the Gothic, what are we broadly talking about? Well, if I can just give you certain key images, it is going to become easier for you to understand what is meant by the Gothic. Darkness, lack of light, ruined houses, empty houses, few people, shadows, thunder and lightning, emptiness. These are the classic elements of a Gothic narrative. In short, everything that invokes terror. And remember that if enlightenment is all about light, then Gothic then becomes all about darkness. So therefore there is a clear light and darkness binary that is operative when we think about the Gothic. And this becomes particularly important for us to keep in mind when we are looking at American literature, because as you may have learnt from another module, there is a period in American literature, 19th century, which is also known as the Romantic period, or at least the American version of what is the Romantic period, because Romanticism reaches America about 30 years after it flowers in England. And in this Romantic tradition, you certainly have people like Herman Melville, you've got people like Nathaniel Hawthorne, but you certainly also have Edgar Allan Poe. So what Coleridge was doing to Romantic poetry in England, Poe was also doing something rather similar in American prose, in American poetry. The Fall of the House of Usher, of course, is a short story, but there are poems that Poe has written, most importantly the poem The Raven, which is equally Gothic. Why is there such a fascination towards the Gothic on the part of Poe? Because something that we have to keep in mind clearly is that if F.O. Matthieson is talking about what is normally called the American Renaissance, then F.O. Matthieson is therefore talking about American literature being reborn again. And when we are talking about American literature being reborn, what we are really talking about is a kind of an American literature that is self-consciously American, a literature that is aware of the fact that there is enormous responsibility riding on their shoulders, that they need to distinguish themselves from literature from the continent. So if you're going to look at American literature, at least the American literature that is produced during the American Renaissance, to quote F.O. Matthieson, then why is it that we are looking at an example like Edgar Allan Poe, who is really using a tradition that is very, very European? Why is Edgar Allan Poe doing that? Well, there are several ways of looking at it, of course. One must understand that Edgar Allan Poe is approaching the Gothic from a very, very personal angle. He had some almost idiosyncratic sort of opinions. And one particular opinion that many of you may find amusing is that he felt that, and this was almost like a spiritual religious opinion, he felt that God is best manifested in sadness. I don't know where he got this opinion from, but he clearly believed that sadness was where one could see God's work best, not in happiness, not in joy, but in sadness. And he also believed that the saddest thing in the world was a beautiful woman who was dying. So look at the way in which he's actually developing this idea that the saddest thing in the world is a dying beautiful woman. So it is not a coincidence, therefore, that in many of Edgar Allan Poe's work, there are beautiful women that are dying with alarming regularity. So here you have another case of a young woman dying because we have the character of Madeline Usher, but we are going to come to that later. Now, if we actually go into the work of Edgar Allan Poe, well, Edgar Allan Poe's most famous tales are the Arabesques. Now, these arabesques were written between the years of 1838 and 1844, and he used the term arabesque for the tales that were fanciful in tone but somber in meaning. And he may possibly have been thinking about the very famous 1001 Arabian Nights, because Poe's arabesques are what could be described as serious entertainments, in the sense that, on the one hand, they could be thrilling. There are motifs of murder and graves and ghosts and darkness and thunderstorm and all of that. So they're very enjoyable, they're very entertaining to read. But also, if one looks beneath the surface, one perhaps discovers meanings that lie hidden. I think this is where I will have to evoke a new discipline or a new way of looking at culture that has come into effect or is now being widely practiced. It has certainly been practiced over the last 20-30 years or so, called cultural studies. Because what cultural studies does is that it looks at popular culture that is ostensibly meant for entertainment. But what cultural studies does is to say that every single cultural artifact that is ostensibly meant for entertainment is not just simply for entertainment. There are deeper meanings in it, there are political meanings in it, there are psychological meanings in it. So therefore, something cannot be simply written off as entertainment. There are deeper levels at which these entertainments work. And if one looks at Edgar Allan Poe's tales, then one could clearly do a cultural studies reading of them, because these were popular, these were thrilling tales. Gothic was very, very popular. And these Gothic tales were also being sort of consumed by men, women. A lot of them were consumed by women because, you know, it was targeted towards the women in many, many ways, because women played very important roles in these stories. But if one goes into deeper reflections, one finds that there are perhaps deeper psychological dimensions, socio-political, socio-cultural dimensions that would perhaps also have to be identified. We now move on to our understanding of the way in which one can regard the Gothic tradition, because one must remember that there is also a sense that Gothic is also, in a very interesting way, a reflection of the Christian anxiety, as I have already told you, regarding Satan, regarding the devil, regarding sin. And so therefore, there is almost this binary that is created, whereby the Gothic becomes the Dionysian to the sort of Apollonian of enlightenment, to the Apollonian of Christianity. So that is also a very important part of the way in which the Gothic tradition works. Well, we move on now to particular aspects of Edgar Allan Poe, and we have to therefore think of the Gothic plot, in which there is very often the vicious pursuit of innocence or innocence for the purposes of power, lust, money, at times singly, at others collectively, issues of identity and power, often relating to family situations of lineage or marriages, which in their turn might affect history, and which in later Gothic works often were centered in smaller numbers of characters, ultimately to operate within the consciousness of just one character, along with sexuality and gender considerations. They came to hold greater importance than the eerie settings that provided mysterious backdrops for equally mysterious speeches and actions in previous Gothic works. I think I would really want you to keep in mind that when we are actually discussing Gothic, we are also doing something very, very interesting, in the sense that although there were many works of Gothic literature that were written by men, there was Gothic literature also written by women, and it would not perhaps be stretching the argument too much to try and suggest that Gothic was, in a very interesting way, also occasionally trying to make space for a certain sense of expression that is perhaps feminine, which perhaps the patriarchal, disciplined, Apollonian literature was not able to accommodate. So therefore, if you actually think about the Gothic as the refuge of the feminine, then that can also be regarded as an interesting way of looking at it. Mind you that since the early 1990s, there has been a huge explosion of scholarship on Gothic literature, which has focused almost entirely on the issues of gender and sexuality in Gothic literature. Those of you who are familiar with vampire tales, for example, will be familiar with Frankenstein, which was written by somebody who was very integrally a part of the Romantic movement, Mary Shelley. Coming down to the 19th century, which is the same century in which Poe is writing The Fall of the House of Usher, you can certainly refer to Bram Stoker's Dracula, in which you have this extraordinary sort of plot where you have one man who is actually a vampire, but he is somebody who is sucking off the blood of other men and other women too. So therefore, exactly how sexuality, gender operate in Gothic tales is an absolutely fascinating area. And I think this is where The Fall of the House of Usher becomes a very crucial text, because if you read The Fall of the House of Usher, you will be able to recognize how sexuality operates in this particular short story. Now, what one also has to keep in mind is that, like in most periods of literary or cultural history, The Fall of the House of Usher is also happening at a time when there are also various tensions which are pulling at authors from two different aspects. So although you still have the remnants of the Age of Enlightenment, so therefore reason, rationality, logic, order still occupy substantial space in the culture, but there are also equally powerful forces for the irrationality, and these are, so therefore there seems to be a peculiar kind of tension, a pulling apart, as it were, of culture, where they are having to decide as to which way to go. And I think The Fall of the House of Usher seems to dramatize that sort of tension in the most remarkable way. So we move on now to the way in which one can look at this particular work. And right at the center of the novel is, of course, the brother-sister duo of Roderick and Madeleine Usher. Now, there have been a lot that has been written about exactly what is the nature of the relationship between Roderick and Madeleine Usher. And of course, the one word that has repeatedly come up for discussion is whether one can detect incestuous feelings between these two characters. And there is perhaps a lot that can be said about it, because you must understand that the House of Usher is a reference to, so this is a play on the notion of the house, because the term house operates not only as a building, but it also operates as a name of a family. So therefore, just as you have the House of Windsor, here also you have the House of Usher. So therefore, this is not just about a building, this is about a family. And remember that this is a family that we are talking about, where the family is an extremely insulated family. This is a family that has been so completely cut off from the rest of the society that the house has got its own weather system. So we are looking at a kind of a peculiar isolation, and into this sort of extraordinary isolation, the narrator comes in. So the narrator actually becomes the other to the self of this particular house. Now, the narrator's sojourn in the Usher mansion with the two inhabitants can be regarded as an inward journey into his soul, the irrational, frenzied, aesthetically prolific Usher, as opposed to the rational, objective, thinking, unnamed narrator. So therefore, here you are able to identify another binary, and I'm going to constantly refer to the Apollonian Dionysian binary because that is the binary that seems to be the organizing binary in the novel. It is basically between order and disorder. It is between sanity and insanity. Now, every time I'm actually going to invoke the binary, please be very careful that there may come a time in the narrative where this binary is going to be interrogated as well. So just because I'm suggesting this binary does not necessarily mean that this binary is going to be sustained at the end of the narrative. Well, let us look at Roderick Usher, for example. What is he like? Well, Roderick is himself in the agonizing position of being able to follow the progress of his own disintegration, which being powerless, he is being absolutely powerless to prevent it. So he suffers from clearly what can be regarded as a mental condition. So he is psychologically unwell, but he sort of witnesses his own disintegration just in front of his own eyes. He believes that the house has the power to dominate the lives of those within. And since he has faith in the consciousness of the very stones of the house, he can very well add another human attribute, possession of the soul, to the House of Usher. So the belief that he himself, Madeleine, and the house have a common soul is but a short step beyond. So look at the way in which he has, how shall I put it? He has managed to give the house a kind of soul which clearly the house is not supposed to have, and yet he has given the house a kind of soul. The house, as it were, has been animated, and that, I think, is something that we should regard as a rather telltale sign to the emotional disintegration and the psychological disintegration of Roderick. The opposition that I would want you to also focus on is the opposition between the physical disease of Madeleine and the mental sickness of Roderick. Now, this is a rather interesting binary because if you look at the way in which patriarchy normally functions, according to patriarchy, men have the mind and women have the body. So therefore, the most precious part of a man's identity is his intellect, and the most precious part of a woman's identity is her body. And in a very interesting way, this is something that Edgar Allan Poe, consciously or unconsciously, seems to be contributing to, because in this case, Madeleine is physically unwell, Roderick is mentally unwell. So there is a clear mapping of the way in which supposedly the best parts of these two characters, the best parts in the eyes of patriarchy, of course, the best parts of these two characters are being gradually destroyed in the front of the reader's eyes. And this also would lead us to think that we find that the actions of the latter, that is to say Roderick's, reveal an inner fight against this particular illness. So in this sense, the letter that he sends to the narrator can be interpreted as his last resource to overcome his condition. In comparison, Madeleine's attitude seems one of submission and surrender to the sickness that affects her. Moreover, she does not only accept her disease, but also, with her final embrace with Roderick, which has got all sorts of incestuous suggestions, involves him in her acceptance of the ailment and their final destruction. So it is almost as though there is a kind of death wish that is operating over here. It is almost as though Madeleine wants to die, and ultimately when she embraces the brother is also being asked to adopt Madeleine's attitude towards this disintegration, which is to say, let us all die, let the house collapse, as indeed it does, and let us collapse with the house itself. So we are looking at blanket collapse. We're looking at the collapse of the mind, we're looking at the collapse of the body, we're looking at the collapse of a house, we're looking at the collapse of a family. We are also looking at the collapse, therefore, of a certain insularity that is also functioning over here. Now, there are obviously various critical opinions about it. There are some who disapprove of Poe's characters. Many critics have commented favorably on his handling as well and presentation of the narrators. Now, what is most interesting is the narrator's state of mind. In several tales, they betray derangement, usually by denying that they are mad. So you will very often find genuinely mad people, in the sense that, I'm not going to say genuinely in the sense that they are actually mad, but people who have perhaps lost sense of reality, of tangible reality. They are constantly going to say that they are not mad, but the way in which they say they are not mad clearly will lead you to think that clearly this is somebody who obviously is not in full possession of their senses. Obsessed with proving their sanity, they tell stories that become elaborate acts of self-defense. Poe, with the characterization of the narrators, makes his point quite clear. The line between sanity and insanity is a thinly veiled one. A sane man can play mad and a madman can feign sanity. So this is exactly what I was talking about when I meant that the binary that I have been talking about between sanity and insanity, I'm not very sure whether that binary is ultimately sustained by Poe. I think he sort of smudges the binary, and I think it is this smudging of the binary which is where you have the power of the narrative. Well, let's talk about the role of the narrator. Oppressed from the beginning of his tale by an utter depression of the soul. So when the narrator comes, we already know that he is unhappy. The narrator speaks thereafter in dark, foreboding tones. The narrator feels an overwhelming apprehension as soon as he sees the house of the Ushers, feeling it most keenly as he views its image and the image of its zigzag flaw in the dark tarn. The narrator's role at the beginning is an observer and witness to the strange events in the house. Yet later, he turns into a participant in these events when he starts to feel the effect of the building and its surroundings on him and on its inhabitants. So therefore, here you have one of perhaps the most interesting examples of what subsequently comes to be known as the unreliable narrator, which is to say, is the narrator credible? Can we believe in what the narrator is saying? Can we believe what the narrator is saying? And this is something which serves as such a wonderful narrative technique that it actually takes fiction to another different level, because if fiction is supposed to be about creating stories, then therefore are we saying that the narrator in these novels are creating stories? So therefore, do we at all believe in what the narrator is saying? Do we at all believe what the narrator is saying? Now, what happens to the narrator after Madeleine's death is not altogether surprising, for since the beginning of the tale, and despite his facade of rationalism, the narrator has shown signs of an imaginative and highly impressionable mind. His first sight of the mansion has affected him with a sense of gloomy foreboding, quite beyond natural explanation. Similarly, his feelings when he first sees Madeleine are impressionistic and irrational, so therefore we do not know whether to trust the narrator. And I think that is what adds the real magic to the story, is that we simply don't know who to believe. It is while going through the short story that one is struck by the symbolic functions that various entities perform in the narrative, where incidents and images which seem innocuous in the beginning carry within them their meaning beyond themselves. There are various symbols that are operating. And of course, something that I've already mentioned about is of course the symbol of the house. This is something that we are not unfamiliar with. There are other novels that you can look up, The Castle of Otranto being one, for example. And so therefore, we can look at the way in which a castle, a lonely building, uninhabited building, ill-lit building, these houses serve as remarkably powerful settings for the Gothic, and Edgar Allan Poe is clearly using one such house. Not only does it talk of the dynasty of the Usher line, so to speak, it is a profound and intricate metaphor of the self. The narrator's invitation and the entry into the household may be taken as a journey into the dark recesses of the human psyche. It is the description and situatedness, or the situation of his tales, in huge mansions and dungeons that Poe utilized for a greater purpose. So, if somebody wishes to do a psychoanalytic study of the House of Usher, Fall of the House of Usher, they are totally welcome to do that. And I think a psychoanalytic reading, a Freudian reading of the text is going to reveal perhaps more meanings. And there is every reason to believe that this is a kind of study that certainly has been undertaken, but more such studies can be undertaken in the future. And we look at Roderick himself. So Roderick himself tells the narrator that over the centuries the mansion and the family had been so bonded as to become identified as one. Moreover, the diminishing of the Usher family through years of inbreeding to this one lonely brother and sister precisely parallels the physical collapse of the house, standing far apart from the civilization as it does in some extent lonely tract of country. So the pairing between Roderick and the mansion is sustained in the careful detailing of descriptions as the narrator observes the first, the one, then the other, and discerns unnerving similarities. And I think this is something that I think you should really be alerted to, in the sense that it is almost as though Roderick is an extension of the house. This is where I would want to invoke a kind of metaphor. Well, actually two metaphors. I would want to remind you of the metaphors of synecdoche and metonymy. Now, as you very well will know, metonymy and synecdoche, they both stand part for whole. But the difference between metonymy and synecdoche is that in the case of metonymy, the part can be very easily separated from the whole. But as far as synecdoche is concerned, the part is organic to the whole. And in this case, therefore, it becomes very interesting for us to try and understand whether Roderick is he therefore metonymic of the house, or is he synecdochic of the house, in the sense that it almost seems to be at certain points as though Roderick is an extension of the house. It is almost as though Roderick is a part of the house's architecture. So these are the ways in which Roderick has been created. And of course, any discussion of the novel is going to be incomplete unless I talk about the black tarn. Now, the black tarn is associated with the imagery of desolation, grey sedge and decay, rotting trees, as well as the house itself as the haunted palace makes clear, and it operates throughout as a symbol of Roderick. An emblematic statement of the relationship between the house-man symbol and the tarn is made when the narrator sees them joined together by a crack in the structure of the mansion, the crack representing the imminent collapse of Roderick's ruined personality. Now, so as we come to the rounding up of our discussion of the Fall of House of Usher, there are certain things that I would want to again ask you to keep in mind. First is, of course, psychological horror. So one can actually read this particular work of literature as an exploration of the inner recesses of the human mind. There are dark corners of the human mind. There are aspects of our minds, of our psychology, that we are perhaps always not very keen to examine. So is Poe telling us that we need to explore the darker recesses of our mind, and once we explore the darker recesses of our mind, that may not entirely be a pleasurable activity, but is Poe therefore saying that this is an activity that is necessary? The other very important aspect of the Fall of House of Usher that I would strongly want you to take note of is, of course, the binary between sanity and insanity. Who is sane? Who is insane? Are we permanently insane? Are we permanently sane? Those who appear to be sane, are they really sane? Those who appear to be insane, are they really insane? Mind you, that when Poe is playing with this idea of sanity and insanity, he is actually continuing a very, very long tradition in literature, at least going back to Shakespeare. You have to remember that in Shakespeare, when tragic characters go mad, most importantly in the case of King Lear, that is when they are the most sane. So therefore, you look at characters who have grown mad while they are sane, they do completely mad things. Again, example of King Lear. But once they go mad, then there is this astonishing clarity that comes over them. So therefore, what exactly is being meant by madness? What exactly is being meant by sanity? I think Edgar Allan Poe is completely going along that direction in discussing these elements. Definitely, we need to pay attention to the supernatural element, the Gothic, which I have also talked about, and of course, the untrustworthiness of the narrative voice. Can we believe the narrator? Because once we actually talk about the way in which we can't rely on the narrator, then I think it almost becomes metafictional fiction about fiction, in the sense that if we are going to say that fiction is about lying, and then we have a narrator in the fiction who is then lying, so therefore there are two levels of lying. And I think this sort of, hypermendacity, if you want to use that term, what this hypermendacity does is that it reinforces the notion that ultimately literature is a very carefully constructed fable in which, the line between reality and unreality is also very, very smudged. I would simply want to conclude this particular discussion by saying that, the house comes to life only to collapse and die. But for Poe, the paradox works both ways. So the fall of the house gives rise to the story which lives off paradox and other uncanny verbal structures. Thank you.